Hello, I'm Paulina Bren, and I teach in International Studies, Women's Studies, and Media Studies. And welcome. And today I'm going to be talking about work that became my first book, called The Greengrocer and His TV, The Culture of Communism After 1968. So I want to begin with images of a statue. It's actually a bridge in Prague leading up to a statue on what's known as Letná, which was where all the May Day parades during communism took place. This statue was built on May Day in 1955, and it was about 30 meters high. And to give you a sense of this, it was, of course, sort of one of those socialist realist monstrosities. It was Stalin at the very front, followed by workers supporting him. And of course, as soon as this went up in Prague, there were many jokes about it. One of the jokes was that he's reaching into his pocket to pay for the monstrosity of a monument that was erected in Prague. Another joke was that he sort of pushed his way to the front of the line at the butchers. Now, the biggest joke, of course, was actually, this came up in 1955. Only a year later, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was at the 20th Party Congress. It was a secret Congress a year later. And there, for the first time, he dared to denounce Stalin. So in a sense, just as Stalin went up in Prague, Stalin came down ideologically in the Soviet Union. But it would be another 6 years before Stalin in Prague was actually exploded. Many reasons for this. There were a lot of Stalinist skeletons in the closets of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. So it wouldn't be until 1962 that happened. But what's interesting is up there, as you saw on that hill in Prague, where Stalin was placed very prominently, after he was exploded, it became an empty plinth. There was nothing. And that was the case, actually, from 1962 until the 1990s, when actually Michael Jackson was doing a tour of Europe, and he was in Prague. And as a publicity stunt, they put up a statue of Michael Jackson where Stalin had been. So why am I telling you this? Well, first of all, statues themselves tell us a lot. But their absences tell us a tremendous amount as well. What this absence of anything in that prominent place in Prague tells us is that there was a real ideological vacuum for the period of basically the 70s and 80s. In other words, what was communism supposed to be in the Eastern Bloc after the death of Stalin and the implosion of his symbolism? Well, there certainly was in Prague an effort to try to sort of put something on that plinth, we could say, to define what communism would now be. That definition came about during 1968, the so-called Prague Spring, which was a very lively, very political but also cultural moment in Czechoslovakia, which in many ways linked arms with the other 1968 movements across the globe. And in Czechoslovakia, the idea was Czechs and Slovaks were going and saying, we want socialism with a human face. But that aspiration was very quickly put down in August of the same year with the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now, what is interesting is that with that invasion, what was key was this recognition by the public, by ordinary citizens, that, in fact, this was it. They were going to live out their lives under a communist regime. So what now? And that lesson was learned because in 1956, the Hungarians had tried to do the same, and they had also been invaded. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Poles would try to do it too with the Solidarity movement. they were not invaded by the Soviets, but instead, in a sense, they were internally invaded with martial law. So this was really, the devastation was the recognition that how do we go on, right? And in fact, the question is, what would you do? Most of us would like to think that we'd be political dissidents. That this ideological vacuum would now be taken up with our dissent against a regime that we did not believe in. And in fact, there were political dissidents. Czechoslovakia particularly became famous for its intellectuals turned political dissidents. Most famously, and you see him on these pictures, but here we have Václav Havel, who was a famous playwright and essayist. He would later become the president of post-communist Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. And he became synonymous with the 1970s and 1980s in Czechoslovakia. But the fact was, less than 0.1% of people in Czechoslovakia became dissidents, officially signed on as dissenting. Because the point was, after these invasions, after 1968, the way to survive was to be depoliticized. It was to turn in on oneself and to simply exist within the environment of family and friends. And there have been arguments that this was a form of dissent, that people were not dissenting in the way that Václav Havel was, but by turning away into their private lives, they were. But I argue that's actually not right, that sort of internalization, the turning away from the political to the private, was something people did after 1968. It was fully encouraged by the communist regime. In fact, they were at one in this decision. And one of the ways that I trace this is to actually look at socialist era, 1970s, 1980s, communist era, socialist soap operas. They were sort of these finite drama, little comedy thrown in series, incredibly popular. And in many ways, they really underscored, they emphasized, they encouraged, they applauded the kind of depoliticization that one sees in the 70s and 80s. They also said a private citizen is a good citizen. Privatized citizenship, a turning away from the public sphere, is a good thing. And so while, yes, there was propaganda, this image is from it was in a village, you would see these kind of propaganda posters everywhere. But they were performative propaganda. The politics that they pointed to was not something the regime actually wanted people to take seriously, because politics had always led to revolt of some kind. And returning to Václav Havel, what is interesting is that he recognized that the kind of lives lived, everyday life in the 70s and 80s, in the Eastern Bloc, that was a life of political apathy, encouraged with consumption, was something that was also very familiar to Western capitalistic democratic countries. And he wrote, "And in the end is not the grayness and the emptiness of life in the post-totalitarian system." He called late communism post-totalitarian system only an inflated caricature of modern life in general? And do we not in fact stand as a kind of warning to the West, revealing to it its own latent tendencies? And I think that's something worth thinking about. Thank you.